Welcome. Tonight's story takes us deep into Louisiana, 1839, where whispers spread across plantations about an enslaved girl so feared that grown men avoided her shadow. They said she was beautiful, clever, and deadly, and that 15 men met their end after crossing her path. But was she truly a killer, or a convenient monster created by a brutal system desperate for control? As we unravel this dark historical case, remember, stories like this aren't easy to research. Every detail comes from digging through painful, real records. So before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe to support the hard work that goes into uncovering true stories history tried to bury. In 1839, Louisiana plantation society was built on fear, hierarchy, and absolute control. Wealthy landowners ruled vast stretches of land, where enslaved people were treated as property, not human beings, and every aspect of life was regulated by violence or the threat of it. The plantations functioned like small kingdoms, with masters at the top, overseers enforcing discipline, and enslaved men and women forced into exhausting labor from dawn until nightfall. Any disruption to this rigid order was seen as a direct threat to the entire system. Social life among white plantation owners was filled with contradictions. Lavish dinners, church gatherings, and formal manners existed alongside extreme cruelty carried out behind closed doors. Publicly, plantation society presented itself as civilized and moral, but privately it relied on punishment, coercion, and dehumanization to survive. Enslaved women, in particular, were trapped in a dangerous space where their bodies were constantly vulnerable to exploitation, yet they had no legal voice or protection. Rumors traveled fast in this environment. With little formal law applied equally, gossip and whispered stories often carried more weight than truth. A single accusation could spread from one plantation to another within days, growing darker and more exaggerated with each retelling. In a society already terrified of rebellion, any unusual death or unexplained event was quickly blamed on the enslaved population, reinforcing existing fears and justifying harsher control. Plantation owners lived in constant anxiety about losing power. Memories of uprisings like the Haitian Revolution still haunted the American South, and Louisiana, with its large enslaved population, felt especially vulnerable. Any enslaved person who appeared intelligent, confident, or resistant was viewed as dangerous. A young enslaved girl who did not behave with expected submission could easily be labeled a threat, regardless of evidence. The legal system offered no fairness. Enslaved people could not testify against white men, and accusations made by owners or overseers were rarely questioned. Trials, when they happened at all, were often rushed and symbolic, designed to reinforce authority rather than uncover truth. Punishments were severe and public, meant to serve as warnings to others rather than justice for victims. Within this brutal structure, stories of violence took on a life of their own. Deaths caused by disease, accidents, or interpersonal conflict were sometimes blamed on enslaved individuals to protect white reputations. Plantation society preferred a terrifying myth over uncomfortable truths, especially if that myth justified continued domination and fear. This was the world in which the story of the enslaved girl emerged, a society primed to believe the worst, eager for monsters, and unwilling to look at its own cruelty. In 1839 Louisiana, truth often mattered less than control, And once a story fit the fears of plantation society, it no longer needed proof to survive. Almost nothing concrete is known about the enslaved girl's origins, and that silence itself speaks volumes about the era she lived in. Enslaved children were rarely recorded as individuals. They were listed as numbers, ages, or physical descriptions in plantation ledgers, if they were recorded at all. Her real name may never have been written down, or it may have been deliberately erased over time, leaving behind only fragments of a story shaped by those who held power over her life. It is believed she was born into slavery, likely on a Louisiana plantation, or sold there as a child through the domestic slave trade. Families were often separated without warning, and many children grew up without knowing their parents or where they came from. This constant instability shaped a generation that learned early how to observe, adapt, and survive in a world where affection could be taken away at any moment. Descriptions of her appearance come entirely from second-hand accounts, many written years later and filtered through fear or moral judgment. Some described her as unusually beautiful, others as unsettling or intense. But these portrayals say more about the observers than about the girl herself. Enslaved women were frequently sexualized by white society, and beauty was often twisted into something dangerous when paired with intelligence or confidence. Little is known about her daily life, but like most enslaved girls, she likely began working at a very young age. Domestic labor, field work, or serving in the main house would have exposed her to constant surveillance and vulnerability. If she worked indoors, she would have been closer to white men in positions of authority, increasing both the risk of abuse and the chances of becoming the subject of rumors. Her personality, as described in surviving stories, was labeled as quiet by some and defiant by others. Such contradictions are common in accounts of enslaved people because resistance did not always look the same. Silence could be a shield, while confidence could be interpreted as rebellion. Any behavior that did not match expectations of obedience was often seen as threatening. As whispers about her began to spread, her past was rewritten to fit the narrative being built around her. Ordinary moments were recast as suspicious, and natural human reactions were transformed into signs of guilt. Without a recorded history of her own voice, others were free to invent one for her, shaping her identity into something dark and dangerous. In the end, the unknown origins of the enslaved girl made it easier for plantation society to turn her into a symbol rather than a person. With no documented family, no testimony, and no written defense, she became whatever the story demanded her to be. Her erased beginnings allowed fear to fill the gaps, creating a legend where a human life once existed. As the story spread across Louisiana, a sharp divide emerged between rumor and what little could be verified through records. Plantation society relied heavily on oral storytelling, and facts often dissolved as stories passed from one person to another. A strange death, a missing man, or an unexplained illness could quickly become something far more sinister once fear and imagination took control. In this environment, truth was fragile, while rumors were powerful and contagious. Most of what survives about the case comes from plantation letters, court fragments, and later retellings, none of which were written to protect the enslaved. These documents focused on property loss, disruptions, or perceived threats rather than evidence. When deaths were mentioned, causes were often vague, conveniently avoiding medical explanations that might point to disease, accidents, or violence between white men themselves. Rumors filled in where documentation failed. Whispers claimed the girl had a strange influence over men, that those who spent time near her met sudden and violent ends. Each retelling sharpened the story, adding intent where none was proven and patterns where coincidence may have existed. In a superstitious society, unexplained death demanded a human cause, and the enslaved were the easiest targets. Fear magnified these stories. Plantation owners already believed rebellion could come from anywhere, and tales of poisoning, seduction, or secret plots fed their paranoia. A single accusation could transform into a series of supposed crimes, with each death retroactively added to the legend. Once the idea took hold, every loss was interpreted as confirmation rather than coincidence. Official records, when examined closely, fail to support many of the more dramatic claims. There are gaps in dates, missing names, and inconsistencies that suggest exaggeration or deliberate distortion. Yet those gaps were rarely questioned at the time. The absence of clear evidence did not weaken the accusations. Instead, it made them easier to manipulate. The enslaved girl herself had no way to counter these narratives. She could not testify, publish her account, or challenge the claims made against her. Silence was imposed on her, and that silence was interpreted as guilt. Plantation society accepted rumor as proof because it reinforced existing beliefs about control and danger. In the end, the line between rumor and record was deliberately blurred. Plantation society did not need certainty, it needed a story that justified fear and punishment. By allowing rumor to outweigh documentation, the system protected itself, even if it meant destroying the truth and the life of an enslaved girl who could never speak for herself. The accusations of seduction were central to how the story was framed, and they reflected deep fears within plantation society, rather than proven actions. Enslaved women were often blamed for the desires of white men, accused of using charm or manipulation to explain relationships that were rooted in power and coercion. By labeling encounters as seduction, society shifted responsibility away from men who held absolute authority and placed it onto someone who had no legal or social protection. In the rigid moral code of the time, white womanhood was idealized as pure, while enslaved women were portrayed as dangerous and immoral. This false contrast made it easy to believe that an enslaved girl could tempt men into ruin. Any attention she received, whether forced or voluntary on the part of the man, was twisted into evidence against her. Her existence alone became suspicious. Plantation gossip amplified these ideas. A man seen speaking to her, spending time near her, or showing favoritism could quickly become the subject of whispers. If that man later fell ill, disappeared, or died, the connection was assumed rather than proven. The accusation of seduction created a neat explanation that protected male reputations while reinforcing racist myths. The language used in surviving accounts is telling. Words like bewitching, or natural, or corrupting appear frequently, revealing how fear and superstition replaced reason. These descriptions were less about actions and more about controlling narratives. Once labeled seductive, every gesture, look, or silence was interpreted as deliberate manipulation. There is no evidence that the enslaved girl had any real agency in these alleged encounters. Refusing advances could result in punishment, while compliance was later reframed as guilt. This double bind ensured that she could never be innocent in the eyes of plantation society. Survival itself became grounds for accusation. The idea of seduction also served a political purpose. It warned other enslaved women of the consequences of being noticed and reassured white society that its hierarchy remained intact. By portraying her as a temptress, the system justified harsh discipline while avoiding any examination of abuse or exploitation. Ultimately, the accusations of seduction reveal more about the fears and hypocrisies of 1839. Louisiana than about the girl herself. They transformed coercion into crime and vulnerability into danger. In doing so, plantation society created a story that blamed the powerless and protected those who already held control. The deaths of white men linked to the story were described as mysterious, sudden, and deeply unsettling to plantation society. Some were said to have fallen ill shortly after encounters with the enslaved girl, while others reportedly died under unclear circumstances that lacked witnesses or medical explanations. In a time when disease was common and medical knowledge was limited, sudden death was not unusual. Yet these cases were treated differently because fear had already chosen a suspect. Malaria, yellow fever, infections, and untreated injuries claimed lives regularly in Louisiana's hot, swampy climate. Men often worked long hours, drank heavily, and ignored early signs of illness. Despite this, natural causes were rarely considered when a death could be framed as intentional. Once suspicion formed around the girl, coincidence was reinterpreted as pattern, and unrelated deaths were drawn into the same dark narrative. Details about the supposed victims are frustratingly vague. Names are often missing, dates conflict, and locations blur together in later accounts. Some men were overseers, others laborers or visitors, but few can be clearly identified in surviving records. This lack of specificity did not weaken the story at the time. Instead, it allowed the number of deaths to grow with each retelling. As fear spread, every loss began to feel connected. A man who collapsed days after being on a plantation where the girl lived was assumed to be another victim. Cause and effect were no longer required. Proximity alone was enough. Plantation society, already anxious about control, preferred a terrifying explanation over admitting vulnerability to disease or internal violence. Whispers suggested poison, secret meetings, or calculated revenge, but no physical evidence supported these claims. There were no consistent reports of substances, weapons, or witnesses. What remained were assumptions layered on top of each other, forming a story that felt true because it aligned with existing fears about rebellion and retribution. The number, 15, itself may have been symbolic rather than factual. Large numbers made the story more powerful, more frightening, and more useful as a warning. Whether the real figure was smaller or non-existent mattered less than the impact the claim had on behavior and belief. Exaggeration served control. In the end, the mysterious deaths reveal how quickly uncertainty turns into accusation. Instead of questioning the conditions that led to illness and mortality, plantation society chose a human scapegoat. The enslaved girl became the explanation for deaths that may never have been connected at all. her story shaped not by proof, but by fear desperate for an enemy. As the rumors intensified, fear began to take hold among overseers in a way that was unusual for men accustomed to absolute authority. These were individuals who enforced punishment daily and believed themselves untouchable. Yet whispers about the enslaved girl unsettled them. Fear did not come from proof, but from uncertainty. An invisible threat was far more disturbing than open resistance. Overseers relied on intimidation to maintain control, and the idea that someone powerless could quietly harm them challenged that belief. Even the suggestion that an enslaved girl might be responsible for deaths undermined their sense of dominance. Some reportedly avoided being alone near her, while others increased surveillance, convinced that danger was lurking in ordinary moments. This fear fed paranoia. Overseers began interpreting small incidents as signs of conspiracy, shared glances between enslaved people, whispered conversations, or delayed responses to commands. The girl's presence became symbolic, a focal point for anxieties that had existed long before her name entered the rumors. She was no longer seen as an individual, but as a threat to order itself. In response, control tightened. Punishments grew harsher, rules stricter, and patrols more frequent. Overseers sought to reassert authority through force, believing fear would restore balance. Ironically, this escalation only reinforced the myth that something dangerous was unfolding, further validating their own terror. Some overseers reportedly tried to protect themselves through superstition rather than reason. Stories circulated of charms, prayers, or warnings shared among them, reflecting how deeply fear had overridden logic. In a society that prided itself on power and masculinity, this quiet panic revealed cracks beneath the surface. The enslaved population felt the consequences immediately. Increased brutality was justified as prevention. Even though no evidence existed, the girl became an unspoken excuse for cruelty. Her alleged threat used to rationalize suffering inflicted on many others who had nothing to do with the story. Ultimately, the fear among overseers exposed the fragility of plantation authority. A system built on violence depended on the belief that control was absolute. The mere idea that it could be challenged from within, silently, was enough to terrify those who enforced it, proving that power maintained through fear is always vulnerable to it. The power imbalance on the plantation was absolute, and survival for the enslaved girl required constant vigilance and adaptation. Every action was measured against the potential consequences from overseers, masters, or even fellow enslaved people who were sometimes forced into complicity. In such an environment, intelligence, observation, and timing were essential tools for navigating life under constant threat. Her alleged ability to influence men or avoid punishment may have been less about supernatural skill and more about understanding the strict social hierarchy. She would have learned very quickly which words to speak, which behaviors to avoid, and when silence could serve as protection. Every encounter with a white person carried the risk of violence, accusation, or worse, and even minor missteps could be deadly. The imbalance extended beyond immediate safety to everyday opportunities. Education, mobility, and basic autonomy were denied, leaving the enslaved girl dependent on observation and intuition to exert any control over her life. What outsiders interpreted as cunning or seduction may simply have been survival instincts sharpened by relentless oppression. Fear on the part of the white population only reinforced her precarious position. The more people feared her, the more dangerous her reality became, as punishments or scrutiny intensified. Yet paradoxically, that same fear may have provided a form of protection. Overseers hesitant to act directly could allow her small margins to maneuver. Relationships with other enslaved individuals were similarly complicated. Trust was difficult because betrayal could be coerced. Survival often required secrecy, discreet alliances, and the ability to read intentions accurately. Every social interaction carried weight, and errors could be lethal. The girl's life demonstrates how extreme power imbalances distort perception. What outsiders saw as manipulation, seduction, or danger was often the product of an enslaved person navigating a brutal system. Her intelligence and awareness were survival mechanisms, not crimes in themselves, though society interpreted them as threats. Ultimately, her story highlights the cruel irony of power and survival. In a world designed to strip away autonomy, the very skills that kept her alive, observation, discretion, and adaptability, were framed as dangerous, feeding the legend of the most dangerous young slave, while masking the reality of oppression she endured every single day. Interrogations and forced confessions were a central part of how plantation society tried to assert control, and the enslaved girl was not immune to this brutal system. Enslaved people, accused of crimes, real or imagined, were often questioned under extreme duress, with the threat of punishment looming over every answer. These interrogations were rarely about discovering truth. They were about reinforcing authority and producing a narrative that suited the interests of white society. Techniques used during interrogations could include sleep deprivation, physical punishment, and intimidation. Witnesses or accomplices might be coerced into implicating others, whether willingly or under threat of harm. In this environment, even innocent statements could be twisted into evidence of guilt. For a young girl, especially, the pressure would have been terrifying and inescapable. Forced confessions often served as proof regardless of accuracy. Plantation authorities were eager for admissions of guilt to validate the fears and rumors swirling around her. A coerced confession could be publicized to warn other enslaved people about the consequences of disobedience, reinforcing the perception that punishment was just and deserved. The legal framework offered no protection. Enslaved individuals had no right to counsel, no ability to appeal, and no chance to confront accusers. Interrogation became an extension of the plantation's power structure, where authority and violence replaced evidence and fairness. Even if she protested her innocence, her words carried little weight against the weight of systemic oppression. These processes were often ritualized. Authorities believed that the right combination of fear, pressure, and punishment would extract the truth. What emerged from interrogations was less about facts and more about producing a story that reinforced hierarchy, control, and the perceived dangers of the enslaved girl. The confessions that survive in records, if any, must be understood in this context. They do not reflect voluntary admission, but the results of coercion, misinterpretation, and systemic abuse. Historians caution against taking such statements at face value because they were constructed under duress, often with the intent of creating a scapegoat. Ultimately, interrogations and forced confessions reveal the cruel machinery behind the legend. The story of the girl as a killer was amplified by procedures designed to extract guilt, not truth. By the time it reached the wider plantation community, her humanity had been stripped away, leaving only the narrative imposed by fear and authority. The role of plantation justice in the story of the enslaved girl was more about maintaining order than uncovering truth. On plantations, rules were often informal, inconsistent, and enforced at the discretion of the owner or overseers. Punishment was swift and brutal, designed to instill fear rather than deliver justice. In this system, an accusation alone could justify severe consequences, and there was little room for investigation or impartial judgment. Trials, when they occurred, were typically performative. Enslaved people accused of crimes were rarely allowed to speak in their own defense, and white witnesses' testimonies were given far more weight than any evidence. The goal was not to determine guilt based on fact, but to demonstrate that disobedience or perceived threats would be punished decisively. The girl's alleged actions placed her at the center of such a system where fear dictated outcomes more than proof. Punishments were often public and designed to serve as warnings. Other enslaved people were expected to witness beatings, whippings, or other penalties, reinforcing the social hierarchy and discouraging resistance. In this environment, a single accusation could escalate quickly into severe physical and psychological torment, regardless of whether the accused had actually done anything. Plantation justice was intertwined with superstition and rumor. Fear of rebellion or unexplained deaths meant that alleged offenders could be judged based on suspicion alone. The enslaved girl's story was amplified by this framework. Her alleged crimes became symbolic of potential chaos that had to be controlled rather than individual acts to be examined in detail. Masters and overseers also used justice as a tool of control over each other. Demonstrating the ability to punish or dominate could elevate one's status, while failing to respond to rumors could be seen as weakness. In this sense, the girl's legend may have been bolstered by competing interests among white authorities who needed to assert dominance and protect their reputations. The system left little room for fairness or investigation. Records were often incomplete, selective, or deliberately altered to fit the narrative that best preserved plantation authority. In her case, any documentation that might have suggested innocence was likely ignored or erased, leaving only fragments that reinforced her reputation as dangerous. Ultimately, plantation justice was less a reflection of crime and more a reflection of power. The enslaved girl's supposed guilt was convenient, reinforcing fear, control, and hierarchy. Her story demonstrates how legal processes in such a society were manipulated to maintain authority, punish the powerless, and create legends that served the interests of the ruling class. Media and oral exaggeration played a crucial role in shaping the legend of the enslaved girl, turning isolated incidents into a sensationalized story that spread far beyond the plantation where she lived. In 1839 Louisiana, newspapers were limited but influential, often catering to the fears and prejudices of white readers. Sensational accounts of violence, crime, or unusual deaths were printed with little concern for accuracy, and stories about enslaved people were particularly prone to exaggeration. Even more powerful than newspapers were oral stories passed from plantation to plantation. Travelers, traders, and workers carried tales of the girl's supposed crimes, embellishing details along the way. Each retelling added a new layer of fear, transforming her into a larger-than-life figure who seemed capable of extraordinary and malevolent acts. These narratives often prioritized drama over fact, appealing to curiosity and reinforcing existing social anxieties. Exaggeration was also fueled by a desire to explain the unexplainable. Sudden deaths, illnesses, or accidents were common in the harsh conditions of the South, but they lacked satisfying explanations. By linking these events to the girl, storytellers created a narrative that was coherent, terrifying, and memorable. The more sensational the story, the more it spread, even if the truth was far less dramatic. Oral accounts often focused on her appearance, demeanor, and supposed abilities, portraying her as both seductive and deadly. These descriptions served a dual purpose. They entertained and reinforced social hierarchies by depicting an enslaved girl as dangerous to white men. Fear and fascination became intertwined, making the legend difficult to separate from reality. As exaggeration spread, even people who had never met her began to believe in her powers. Names, numbers, and events were altered or inflated to fit the growing legend. The story of 15 men killed may have originated from a handful of incidents, but repetition and embellishment transformed it into accepted truth, further fueling paranoia across the region. Exaggerated stories were not just entertainment, they were tools of control. By portraying the girl as a supernatural threat, the plantation elite reinforced the idea that enslaved people were unpredictable and dangerous. This justified strict discipline and reinforced the fear necessary to maintain the social order. In the end, media and oral exaggeration ensured that the enslaved girl's story endured long after the events themselves, becoming a cautionary tale, a legend, and a symbol of the fears that pervaded plantation society. Her humanity was lost in the process, replaced by a narrative constructed to terrify, control, and entertain, leaving historians to untangle fact from fiction decades later. Whether the enslaved girl was truly guilty or merely a scapegoat remains one of the most haunting questions of her story. Plantation society was quick to assign blame to individuals who were powerless, and in many cases, legends of criminality were less about evidence than about reinforcing existing fears. Her supposed guilt may have been imagined to explain events that had natural or unrelated causes. The system in which she lived made innocence difficult to prove. Enslaved people could not testify in their own defense, and their accounts were rarely recorded. Any attempt to assert innocence could be ignored, punished, or used as further evidence of cunning. In this context, the line between actual wrongdoing and imagined threat was blurred beyond recognition. Many historians suggest that the narrative of guilt served a social function. It created a visible enemy, a tangible reason for fear, and justified extreme measures of control. By portraying the girl as dangerous, plantation owners and overseers reinforced the idea that enslaved people were inherently threatening, absolving themselves of responsibility for the harsh conditions, exploitation, and violence that defined the system. Accusations of seduction and murder may also have functioned as a way to explain male vulnerability. White men accused her of manipulation because the reality that they were responsible for coercive interactions was unacceptable. Blaming an enslaved girl allowed them to maintain reputations while diverting attention from their own complicity in a system of oppression. The ambiguity of the deaths attributed to her adds to the uncertainty. Records are incomplete, contradictory, or missing entirely. With little concrete evidence, each retelling relied on assumption and fear. The number of alleged victims, 15, may have been symbolic, chosen for dramatic effect rather than verified through documentation. Over time, her story was shaped as much by the imagination of storytellers as by events themselves. As years passed, the girl became a figure of legend, a cautionary tale warning of the dangers supposedly posed by enslaved women who defied expectations. In this sense, guilt became a narrative device rather than a factual assessment. Ultimately, whether she was guilty or not, the girl's life illustrates the cruelty of a society that could convert fear into legend and oppression into proof of wrongdoing. Her story challenges us to recognize how power, rumor, and systemic injustice can destroy truth, leaving only a shadowy image of a life caught in the machinery of fear. How history remembers the enslaved girl is shaped almost entirely by the stories told by those in power, rather than by her own voice or experiences. Over time, accounts of her alleged crimes were repeated in newspapers, memoirs, and oral histories, each retelling adding new embellishments and emphasizing fear, seduction, and death. The result is a legend that obscures the real person behind it, leaving her as a symbol rather than a human being with a life, thoughts, and feelings. Her story has endured precisely because it taps into deep societal fears. The idea that someone with little power could wield influence over the powerful and disrupt the established order. This narrative has been sensationalized for over a century, turning a young enslaved girl into a figure of mystery and terror. In many ways, her legend tells us more about the anxieties and biases of 19th century Louisiana than about her actual life. Modern historians struggle to separate fact from fiction in her story. With limited records, they must rely on fragmented documents, second-hand accounts, and the biases embedded in each source. The deaths attributed to her, the accusations of seduction, and the fear she supposedly inspired may all have been exaggerated or even entirely fabricated. Yet even with uncertainty, her story persists because it resonates with broader themes of power, oppression, and survival. The way she is remembered also reflects the systemic erasure of enslaved people's voices. She had no opportunity to tell her side of the story, and her humanity was largely ignored in contemporary accounts. As a result, history remembers her as a dangerous figure, while the conditions that shaped her life, the violence, control, and exploitation of slavery, receive far less attention. In folklore and retellings, her story has been transformed into a cautionary tale, emphasizing moral lessons or supernatural fear rather than historical accuracy. This process often amplifies drama over truth, reinforcing the idea that enslaved people could be both feared and blamed for circumstances created by a brutal system. The line between legend and history blurs, leaving her legacy haunted by myth. Her remembrance also demonstrates how narratives are controlled by those in power. Plantation owners, authors, and storytellers determined which details were preserved and which were ignored, shaping her story to serve their purposes. Fear, fascination, and moral panic all contributed to how she was recorded in history, ensuring that her image remained sensationalized and simplified. Ultimately, the way history remembers her is a reflection of society's priorities rather than reality. She exists in records and stories as the most dangerous young slave, or a seductress responsible for deaths, but the truth of her life, her thoughts, struggles, and humanity is largely lost. Her story reminds us that history can be shaped as much by imagination, fear, and power as by fact, and that uncovering the real lives of the oppressed requires careful scrutiny, empathy, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths.